Here's a thought. What if Microsoft doesn't get to buy Activision? I'm not saying it won't happen. Microsoft seems pretty sure it'll go through, but what if it doesn't? In the past few weeks, the deal has been under some increased scrutiny by the CMA, a UK regulating body. This group, and others like it, have the power to stop these kind of acquisitions dead in their tracks. And because of all this, a lot of interesting things have come to light. Now, I'm just gonna get this out here right now. There is no way to know how this is all gonna turn out. Even if the CMA accepts the acquisition, there's still other organizations that could shut it down. And even if all that happens, Microsoft could fight the decision in court. The main question these regulators have is whether Microsoft's acquisition could stifle competition or harm consumers in the long run. And I think this is good. I think these kind of regulations are important so we don't get sent back to the Gilded Age. Both Sony and Microsoft have been throwing hands for the past few weeks trying to defend their corporate positions. Sony argues that Microsoft's acquisition of Activision would harm competition and be anti-consumer in the long run. Microsoft is arguing that Sony already is harming competition and is anti-consumer right now. And honestly, they're both right. Now I'm going to spend the next few minutes ripping on both of these companies, and I imagine some console warriors out there are whipping out their keyboards to defend these brands, so here's my standard console war disclaimer, just in case. So the CMA is primarily concerned about three things: Call of Duty exclusivity, Game Pass, and the cloud. For some reason. Now there's more to it than just this, but these are the major points. Microsoft has responded to the CMA's concerns in the form of a long document and some public relations statements. See, Microsoft has two goals right now. They want to try and explain why acquiring Activision is good for the industry and present themselves as losing the console war. These two standpoints could affect the CMA's decision, and this strategy seems to have influenced every statement Microsoft and the Xbox division and Phil Spencer have said in the past few weeks. It's a lot easier to argue that you're not anti-competitive if you're not in first place. Getting into all this, I'm going to talk about Call of Duty exclusivity, because I kind of have to. My last video was entirely about how Microsoft was removing COD from PlayStation and the effects that it could have on the gaming industry. Well, I was wrong. Probably. Turns out my concerns were shared by the CMA, and they've been really focusing in on this singular issue. And if there is even a doubt that this series will leave competing platforms, the CMA might strike this whole deal down. And as you would expect, this has led to a change in how Microsoft and Sony talk about this issue. Okay, so a while back, Microsoft claimed that Call of Duty would remain on PlayStation after the deal closes for at least a few years. They said that they would honor any pre-existing agreements between Sony and Activision, adding on 3 years to the existing contract. Jim Ryan, PlayStation CEO, made a public stir about this promise, calling it inadequate. Now, the implication here was that Microsoft was planning on removing the franchise around 2028. After this point, the CMA started to become much more concerned about COD on PlayStation. Sony had gone to the CMA voicing concerns over this exclusivity issue, and as the CMA was getting more serious, Microsoft changed its position. Or at least, I think they did. Phil Spencer has said, Call of Duty is not leaving PlayStation. Ever. Not in 5 years, not in 10 years. It will be on the platform as long as PlayStation consoles still exist. Going through the document, Microsoft says they could not even fathom removing Call of Duty from PlayStation because the backlash would be so strong it would permanently damage the Xbox and Call of Duty brands. They also go on to say that they wouldn't even want to remove Call of Duty from PlayStation because most COD players are on PlayStation and they need to rely on those players to make this acquisition financially profitable, or something like that. These are odd justifications for Microsoft to give. For one, if Microsoft was so concerned about public backlash for removing a fan-favorite franchise from a platform, well, what about this one? And the other point about profitability is overly simplified. I've seen this point made a lot online, that removing COD from PlayStation would make no financial sense, because generally more people equals more sales, which means more microtransactions, which means more money. Now, I'm not an accountant, but as far as I understand, this really only applies to cheaper acquisitions, because Call of Duty as a franchise does not make that much money compared to the total cost of buying Activision. It's true that COD can expect to make about $3 billion a year in revenue at its peak. Now that's revenue, not profit. That profit is generally about half of that when everything's said and done, at least as far as I can tell, given these pretty vague financial reports. Again, I don't have the exact numbers of how much money Call of Duty makes on PlayStation in profit, but it's probably around $800 million a year, and possibly half of that is coming from Warzone alone. Now that $800 million, it really is not a lot, not in the grand scheme of this Microsoft deal. Microsoft does not need Call of Duty on PlayStation for this deal to make financial sense. Even if just a small percentage of that user base came to Xbox and a small percentage of that got Game Pass, it would generate more money in the long run, which I'm fairly certain is the original plan. So why would they say all this? Do I think I know better than Microsoft's accountants? No, there is an ulterior motive. It's the fact that Microsoft needs to give up COD exclusivity to get this deal approved, but also they don't want to lose that option outright. The CMA could do more than just reject mergers. They could approve it, like let Microsoft buy out Activision, but with restrictions. The most obvious restriction here is Call of Duty must remain on PlayStation. Microsoft does not want this. The main evidence I have for this is the sheer amount of time they spend in this document arguing that removing COD from PlayStation would not be a big deal. Now, the arguments themselves are pretty flimsy. Once again, they claim that since COD is just one video game franchise and PlayStation has over 4,000 games, removing this one series shouldn't matter. There's a lot of things wrong with that statement, I think we can agree. Microsoft also said sometimes people just don't buy Call of Duty, so its continued success isn't guaranteed. They use COD Vanguard as an example, which notoriously sold worse than other recent entries in the series. Microsoft also argues that if COD was removed from PlayStation, it would give an advantage to Call of Duty's main competitors, like Fortnite, Apex, and FIFA. Now, I do believe Phil when he says COD isn't leaving PlayStation. Maybe not the forever part, but at least for the next decade or so. But the odd part is if Microsoft really did want to just keep COD on PlayStation, which it seems like they do, why wouldn't they just sign another agreement with Sony? I mean, they could just guarantee that it's going to continue on the platform and the CMA would be off their backs immediately. But either way, Sony is still not happy about any of this. They believe that if Microsoft acquired Activision, the ports of Call of Duty to PlayStation would be downgrades of the Xbox or PC versions, lacking features, content, or otherwise inferior. Now there's an irony here, because Sony has been paying Activision to do this exact thing on other platforms, which, as you could guess, gives Microsoft a bit of an edge in this debate. Sony has other concerns though as well, especially in Game Pass. They argue that even if Call of Duty remains on PlayStation, users will switch over to Xbox just to avoid paying $70. Microsoft responded with, "It's more expensive to buy a new console and a Game Pass subscription for existing PlayStation users." And right now, I agree, but in a few years when new consoles launch, obviously that statement would be less true. For the most part, Microsoft doesn't seem to have a great chance of winning this deal based on everything I said. Most of their arguments are flimsy at best. But they do actually have one good point, one case to be made that might actually win them this acquisition. Sony is awful. That's the argument. And Microsoft believes that while the CMA is concerned about bad things they might do in the future, they're ignoring all the bad stuff Sony is doing right now, such as that PlayStation exclusive Call of Duty content. It probably came at the worst time for Sony. Microsoft argues that if Sony is so concerned that Game Pass could become too good of a deal that users would flock to Xbox, why wouldn't they just invest more in their own subscription services? They don't put their own first-party games on PS Plus on day one. Now, they've had several statements defending this position, and from what I can tell, these are kind of lies. They have the money to do it. They just don't. But they have actually been spending money on subscription services that aren't their own. Turns out Sony is paying publishers to keep games off of Xbox Game Pass. They have a clause in their contract with, surprise, surprise, Activision, that Call of Duty can't go on Game Pass. This is bad. This is really bad. The implication here is that Sony could be doing this for a number of publishers, just paying them to keep games off of a competitor's service. And yes, they've done this with third-party titles before, but I don't know, this just feels a little bit grosser. In the eyes of the CMA, I imagine this looks bad because Sony is the market leader. They have the largest market share, and if they are exploiting that by harming competitors' products and the consumers using those competitors' products, it really gives Microsoft a lot of leverage in this debate. Microsoft claims that Game Pass can never have a major influence on the console industry because it only has 25 million subscribers, and the console market as a whole consists of 850 million users. Now, I don't know if they just took every console ever sold and just added it up, but yeah, there are not 850 million console users. Unless 5 people are using every box that is on the market right now, this doesn't work. Phil Spencer recently said that it's unlikely that Game Pass will ever make up more than 15% of the Xbox division's revenue, which is very convenient timing. The CMA views subscription services as a different market than game consoles, and if Microsoft has an advantage in subscription services, the deal could fall through. That's why they just keep saying, oh, it's not doing so well. We really need this deal to stay afloat. And again, if this were true, if Microsoft really thought Game Pass console subscriptions were at their end, why would they be redesigning the Xbox UI around Game Pass right now? Now, Microsoft also mentioned something that we already knew, and it's not a great point. See, they offered to put Game Pass, the whole subscription service, on PlayStation, but Sony refused. Now, Sony does a lot of terrible things, but I gotta admit, there's no reason why Sony would want this on their platform. It just means less people would buy these games from the PlayStation Store, and a majority of that subscription revenue would be going to Microsoft. As I mentioned, the CMA is also quite interested in the cloud, and I think this is the least interesting part of this whole story, and that actually works well for Microsoft's argument. The CMA fears that Microsoft could monopolize the cloud gaming market in some long-term future, but Microsoft says people don't care about the cloud. It won't replace traditional hardware, there's not a lot of growth right now, and a lot of people just aren't interested in it. Now, I'm sure the reason they said all this is just to appease the regulators' concerns, but I still think it's true. Everything Microsoft has said has some motive. Look no further than this clip from an interview with Microsoft's CEO.
And so we feel very, very confident. Of course, any acquisition of this size will go through scrutiny, but we feel very, very confident that we'll come out. We are number 4, number 5, depending on how you count in gaming. In fact, the number 1 player, in this case, Sony, I think even in this period has acquired 3 companies. So if this is about competition, let us have competition.
The comparison between Sony's acquisitions and this one is just such a leap, such mental gymnastics, and they know this. Now, they made a landing page on their website to try and promote their deal, and it's just filled with corporate buzzwords that mean absolutely nothing. Now, King actually makes a lot of money for Activision Blizzard, and generally I don't talk about it, and most people don't talk about it because who cares? Microsoft announced a mobile gaming platform to compete with Apple and Google. I assume they'd leverage King and COD Mobile with this, but I don't. Do you care? I don't care. Honestly, this is one of those stories where there is no winner. There's nobody to cheer for. It's a case of one side is bad in the here and now, and the other side will be bad in the future. In the meantime, I guess we can just enjoy these two fighting it out like it's the comment section of an IGN article. Overly broad generalizations followed by conveniently ignoring any inconvenient information. Keep it up, Phil. Keep it up, Jim. Keep it up, Bobby.